EVO. This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome back to The Devil Within. This is episode 3 in the re-release of season 1 in support of the MGM Plus docuseries Let the Devil In. I hope you're watching. New episodes every Sunday night. Episode 3 is in wide release now. I'd love to know what you think of it. Please email me at info@evocreative.com. Or you can follow us at The Devil Within Pod on Instagram. So episode 3 of season 1 is entitled A Spellbound Palace. A Spellbound Palace is the title of a poem by 19th century English novelist and poet Thomas Hardy. Thomas Hardy is known for, at least in his poetry, for writing about locations specifically that are important to him. Now, A Spellbound Palace isn't one of his better known works, but critics from his time and in our time all point to this poem as one of the better examples of his power as a poet, both for the sense of nostalgia, the really powerful sense of nostalgia that the poem elicits, as well as Hardy's, I guess, masterful use of descriptors. He really puts you in the world of the poem. And when Hardy is writing about these grand Tudor mansions with their gardens and all of their grandeur, he was among the best to do it. And in A Spellbound Palace, it's this Thomas Hardy at his best, where he's recounting a trip to the Hampton Court Palace. And it's evocative of a time in his life where he was happy, where he was with someone he loved, and at the same time there's a layer of darkness or sadness to it, specifically when he describes Hampton Court Palace as history's own asylum. And it's that subtle nod to darkness that made me connect this poem to the topic of episode 3 of the podcast, where I really kind of take a deep dive into the history of Clinton Road and specifically Cross Castle. If you drive a few miles north out of Jefferson Township along Berkshire Valley Road, you'll hit the Hamburg Turnpike, known locally as Route 23. It's a modest highway, 2 lanes in each direction, but it has stoplights and jug handles rather than overpasses, so it's not the most efficient means of travel. And if you're not familiar with New Jersey jug handles, to go left, first you have to go right. It's kind of maddening. Route 23 is, however, one of the main east-west routes through extreme North Jersey, from the Pennsylvania state line until it merges with Route 202 just outside of Paterson. From the northern terminus of Berkshire Valley Road, again, just a few miles from the Sullivan home, a right turn onto Route 23 will have you within a few hundred yards of the exit for the most haunted road in America. Clinton Road is a winding, desolate 10-mile stretch of asphalt and concrete running south to north that connects Route 23 and the Warwick Turnpike in the small community of Upper Greenwood Lake. The New York state line is only a few miles beyond that, but it's Clinton Road that the brave and curious have traveled for years, seeking the ghosts and demons that have been reported to be lurking in the endless forests. The first thing you notice if you drive Clinton Road at night is the complete darkness that surrounds you. There are no light poles at all, no telephone poles, definitely no stoplights, no infrastructure at all that would lead you to believe that should you go missing, you'd have any chance of someone finding you. During the day, it's a different story. The abundance of nature and wildlife draws hikers and outdoor enthusiasts from all over the Northeast. Part of the reason being that Clinton Road itself delineates the eastern border of Wawayanda State Park, which is a popular destination for hikers and for black bears. But Clinton Road is famous for other reasons. Ghost stories, ghost sightings, ghostly encounters. And it all started with a rich man and a dream. By the winter of 1988, Cross Castle had been an empty ruin for more than 30 years, its 3-story stone walls standing eerie and defiant against the slowly encroaching forest. Originally constructed by capitalist Richard J. Cross in 1907, he lived in his splendid home for only 2 years before his untimely death. His third wife wasted no time in abandoning the home on several hundred acres of lush New Jersey forest for the more comforting confines of New York City. At least there, she'd be able to, see other humans. Anyone. Because on the Cross estate, there wasn't another soul for miles in every direction. Also, he didn't name the castle after himself. The name Cross Castle was started by locals years later. The entire estate, consisting of the main residence, several outbuildings, 2 barns, stables, and a private lake, was named Bearfort, apparently out of respect for the most plentiful residents of the area, the American black bear. Richard Cross emigrated from England in the early 1870s and hoped to find his fortune in the burgeoning banking industry that flourished in the receding tide of the Industrial Revolution. His first wife died in 1876, and as was custom at the time, he proceeded to marry his wife's surviving sister. But that marriage was also short-lived, with a second wife dying just 3 years later. Mr. Cross was left with his work, his children, and his ever-growing fortune. He was among the wealthy elite and a father of 6 when he met and married his third wife, and he wanted nothing more than to leave behind the stress and pressure of the city and disappear into the countryside. His children were grown and either away at school or off seeking their own fortunes. Mr. Cross's desire to escape into the woods was kept secret from his young wife. He wanted it to be a surprise. In that venture, he was largely successful. She only learned of his plans when one day he suggested an excursion across the river into the wilds of New Jersey. She agreed. It was only a day trip after all. However, they soon found themselves in the middle of a vast field of rolling grass, framed on all sides by pristine hardwood forests, and her beloved announced that everything she cast her gaze upon was hers. The land, the trees, the rocks, even the sun and the stars. As he spoke, he made sweeping gestures and proclamations worthy of a king, including his promise to move a mountain in order that she may live like a queen. And he did just that. The castle he would construct on the land he now stood upon was built entirely from the abundance of native stone contained within his property. The elaborate woodwork and cabinetry that would one day be on display in his house was to be crafted from the trees now within her sight. As the reality of her husband's proclamation sunk in on the third Mrs. Cross, she began to feel faint. She saw the perfect reality of her penthouse on the Lower East Side with views of the newly constructed Brooklyn Bridge, her status among the socialites and the bon vivants, the ostentatious display of wealth that she so coveted. She saw all that slipping away on a sweet spring breeze in the North Jersey wilderness. Turns out she really did faint, and that was a lucky break for her. If she'd remained conscious, she may very well have spoken her mind and alienated her husband during his proudest moment. But after she was revived, she had time to gather her thoughts and ultimately to hold her tongue. She had no other options. It was either the country estate in Jersey or back to the factory floor as a seamstress, and that was simply out of the question. But the reality was she hated Bearfort. And much to her credit, she never participated in the wild stories and conjecture that slowly seeped out of the local community regarding Mr. Cross and the strange goings-on at his vast estate. Some speculate that her refusal to corroborate any of the more fantastic stories stand as evidence that none of it ever happened. But another way of looking at it is that once the man was dead, her refusal to discuss any aspect of his life, his interests, or his home was the only way to make sure his secrets died with him. So as you hear in the podcast, Richard Cross was an industrialist from England who comes to America seeking his fortune and also with some darker pursuits in mind. I guess it would fall under religious freedom. He wanted to be able to explore the occult and the darkness of the occult and the promised power of some of these forces that had intrigued him since his youth. He also went through a bunch of wives. Not his fault. It's not like he was some swinger. Unfortunately, his first 2 wives died young, and he found a third wife that he adored and decided to include her in his passions for the occult. And the result of those passions for a rich man were to buy a piece of land and build a castle. So he called it Bearfort. We called it Cross Castle, the community, decades later. But to him and his wife and his associates and friends, it was called Bearfort. Now, to this day, there's black bears freaking everywhere in Jersey during bear season. My mom still sends me videos of bears just like kind of strolling through her condo complex and going through people's trash and shit. It's crazy. But it's always been a very heavily wooded area where we live. Tons of wildlife, from deer and possum and raccoons and squirrels and skunks to black bears that scare the crap out of you. So what's interesting, or at least what I find super interesting, which didn't make it into the podcast, is that Jefferson Township, New Jersey, specifically the Milton side in the Berkshire Valley, was the winter home for the Ringling Brothers Circus. Now, not Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey, but the next generation, Alfred T. Ringling, kept the Ringling Brothers name and brand alive. And that was where they wintered. You drive through town still, and you see these buildings from the turn of the 20th century, that were all built with the local rocks, these round, maybe football size to basketball size rocks that were connected with mortar, and massive buildings were built. And there's a huge mansion still there that housed all the circus performers. There's a big tower that I guess the monkeys ran around in. There's a municipal golf course now on that side of town. And some of the old Ringling Brothers buildings were incorporated into the golf course. Like I think the elephant paddock were there. You can still see the walls of the elephant paddock. And then the pump house from Lake Swannanoa. And there are some of the other smaller outbuildings built with the same rock, the same construction, that the town sold to private ownership, and there are small businesses operating out of them now. The reason I bring that up is that if you look at the existing photographs of the ruins of Cross Castle, it's the exact same construction. All of those buildings were built at the same time, the same laborers, the same masons, the same architects, built both of these compounds for these wealthy men. And they were friends. Alfred T. Ringling and Richard Cross. You see their names in each other's guest registries when they would have parties at their houses. And it wasn't just Alfred T. Ringling and Richard Cross that were the big names of the time. In their circle, there was this movement called spiritualism, right? Which is people that claim they could speak to the dead, or that they could tell the future, make prophecies. And the big name back then was Edgar Cayce. And Edgar Cayce is known to have come through Jefferson and to have performed. He's known as the sleeping prophet. He would pretend to be asleep and then sleep talk and make these crazy prophecies. He performed at He performed at Bearfort for a massive crowd of the New York wealthy elite at the time. So beyond the Edgar Cayce events, there were other very well-known, well-publicized events at Bearfort, until two of them ended in tragedy, which I go over in the podcast. Richard Cross arrived in New York City in 1874 as an avowed paganist. He soon met like-minded people who both buoyed his beliefs and expanded his understanding of the limits of those beliefs. His conclusion was that there were no limits. As his fortune grew, so did his tireless pursuit of answers, gleaned through his near-complete transition from pagan worshiper to occult practitioner. His most immersive area of study concerned geography and how it relates to different aspects of paranormal occurrences. At the time, the world was only 20 years away from the accepted reality of the most famous of these geographic anomalies, a patch of the northern Atlantic Ocean where aircraft and ships at sea completely disappear without any warning, without any distress calls, and with alarming frequency. The Bermuda Triangle. Others would soon follow. The Mothman sightings in West Virginia, the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts, and many more that were connected to a larger geographic location instead of a person or a house. It is widely believed that Richard Cross bought those 400 acres just a few miles from Jefferson Township because he believed it was a place where he could experience the darkest and most profound possibilities that his beliefs would allow. After surveying and purchasing the land, Mr. Cross booked passage for England for a sabbatical abroad. He had 3 months before construction was to begin on his new property, and he wanted to be prepared. The purpose of his trip was to collect as much literature as was possible that dealt with a variety of subjects that were incredibly dangerous to even inquire about. The mere possession of some of the volumes he sought would be enough to land him in jail. However, Cross was determined, and, it appears, very successful in his pursuits, for he returned with over a dozen trunks full of books, scrolls, artifacts, and paraphernalia that would adorn the libraries and sitting rooms of his new home. Ancient tomes from Romania and Greece, Chinese texts with accompanying translations, Latin works that appeared to be scripture but were decidedly not, Druidic carvings that had been transferred to parchment via chalk rubbings, instruments of war, daggers and swords, chalices and jewels that had value far beyond their monetary worth, and all of it locked away in a castle in the woods until his death, when it was either destroyed by fire, if it appeared to his widow that it may be illegal, or donated to local entities if it was merely a book or a candlestick. Their use was never fully explained or understood, but it only took 2 years for a once healthy and vibrant man to meet an early death. The first murder was reported at Bearfort in the spring of 1918. A Polish immigrant who had been contracted as a stonecutter described in great detail one of the now infamous celebrations on the estate grounds. It was during the vernal equinox. Though the man reporting the crime had no idea of the relevance of the date, it is nonetheless extremely important. There are 3 other sacred days on the pagan calendar: the autumnal equinox and the summer and winter solstices. What the stonecutter described to local authorities was the celebration of Ostara, a ritual that announces the horned god who dwells in the forest to the spring maiden who emerges from a lake. The maiden then submits to the god in order to renew and rejuvenate nature. In ancient times, when this ritual was contained among only a handful of early Anglo-Saxon tribes, it is written that the woman who represented the maiden in the ritual was sacrificed, for it was believed that, owing to the awesome power of the horned god, the birth of spring was released upon the land immediately after conception, and the vessel, the maiden, was no longer necessary. For centuries that followed, in the more civilized parts of Europe, the woman was replaced with a rabbit when the time came for the blood sacrifice, and the woman would be ceremoniously exalted and worshipped, and would eventually choose a man from the crowd and indulge in a public consummation of the rites of Ostara. This man, the stonecutter, described the ritual exactly as it would have happened. The candles and torches, the pentagram in the middle of the floor, the capes and animal masks, the chanting, the simulated violence that represented spring breaking loose the bonds of winter, even the rabbit. But then he claimed to witness a beautiful woman remove her clothing, be willingly led to a large table, also adorned with a pentagram, have her feet and wrists bound with rope, a blindfold tied around her head, and then he swears he saw a hooded man brandish a large dagger and thrust it into her belly. The investigation was futile. No leads, no other witnesses, no victim or murder weapon, and given the sheer size of the estate, the police weren't exactly sure they had searched the correct room. But apparently, even a minimal amount of exposure to the local authorities was enough for Mr. Cross to curtail future celebrations, and as a result, things were very quiet at the estate. That is, until December of that year, when, after a lavish Christmas party, again in the main ballroom, the teenage daughter of a New York socialite went missing. The story given to police was simply that the young lady went for a walk around the sprawling grounds, alone. Every person at the party, and the guest list had over 150 names, every single one gave the exact same story. The girl's family had the will and the means to demand a full-scale investigation into the disappearance, and they got one. But it turned up nothing. The girl was never found. Although no charges were ever filed, nor was there ever any evidence of a crime committed at Bearfort, there was enough suspicion for Mr. Cross and his estate to be of serious interest to local authorities. But ultimately it wouldn't matter. Mr. Cross would be dead and his castle abandoned in less than a year. But the stories of the extravagant rituals would persist through the generations, so that decades later, when a fringe movement of satanic worship would seep into the suburbs of New York City, the followers would again claim a particular patch of forest to call home. And this time, counted among them would be a boy of 14, who never could have known that the real danger in the woods wasn't the ghostly lights of legend, or the monster lurking in the shadows, or even the handful of his fellow Satanists who were truly dangerous. The real danger to young Tommy, in all likelihood, was the very ground itself. So if you're watching the television show, I'm sure you'll notice that there's no mention of Richard Cross or Bearfort. When I'm being interviewed, I mention experiences out at Clinton Road, and there's a very good reason for no mention of Richard Cross. I know firsthand when I was investigating the podcast that there's very little information on Richard Cross that's available online or anywhere else. The little that I was able to find was very informative, but it was mostly having to do with his daughters who stayed around after he died. There's very, very little about Cross, even less about his wife. There were some records that I found in the microfiche in the archives at the library, but mostly, and even less about him from before he emigrated to the United States. But what I was able to find painted a pretty clear picture about the type of man he was, what his pursuits were, how he made his money, but not how he died. Because he died very young, only 2 years after his compound and his castle were completed. So one of the big differences between the podcast and the television show is the depth and the level of journalism and investigation that went on. When I was doing the podcast, I was by myself. People didn't want to talk to me. Okay, I maybe would ask twice and then I would leave them alone. I didn't really know how to build relationships with sources or anything like that. But now I'm dealing with professionals at this company, the production company, and they know how to do it. They call once, they get a soft no. They call a second time, they get maybe a harder no. Then they let it cool off for a minute. Then they circle back from a different angle. And then they start building a relationship. And then they share some of their other investigative work that they've done. So they show the person, hey, listen, we took care of this source really well. And we told their story in an honest, respectful way. I bet you could trust us too. And then the source starts to loosen up a little bit, starts to warm up a little bit. These conversations on the phone, off the record, get a little longer and get a little more personal. And the next thing you know, they're signing on to be on the show. I loved to see it happen because I would start panicking. I'm like, whoa, we're not going to get Detective Hart. We're not going to get Sister Philomena. We're not going to get these other people. And then slowly, one by one, they all came on board. So I'm so grateful for the level of professionalism from the people who were making the show from Left Right Productions because they did such a great job and they got all these people. So that also informs the lack of information that exists on Richard Cross, because if they could have found it, man, they would have loved to have investigated this part. This whole Richard Cross story was one of Eli Roth's favorite aspects of the podcast. There just wasn't enough there to, A, legally talk about Richard Cross, or B, to have enough verified information to tell the story in any meaningful way. So I didn't give myself that high of a bar when I was writing the podcast. I was relying on stories that I'd grown up with and the limited kind of breadcrumbs I could find online. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Part 2 is coming next. Please make sure you're following The Devil Within on Apple Podcast or Spotify or wherever you listen. Follow us on Instagram at The Devil Within Pod and email the show. If you have any thoughts, concerns, ideas for content, let me know. info@evocreative.com. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Branden Morgan.